My name's Dan Chartrand. I'm the owner of Water Street Bookstore. I want to thank you all for making time tonight to be here. We know you have lots of choices to make about where you spend your evenings, and the fact that you're here tonight with us celebrating the publication of this amazing book, my favorite book so far this year. It means a lot to me that you're all here, so thank you all. And additionally, we have the lack of sidewalks, which will soon be beautiful new sidewalks. So this is a wonderful evening in Exeter. We're also celebrating some long-awaited improvements in investment and infrastructure. So that's a damn good thing. I'm here to introduce Mark DeCarteret, who is a former poet laureate of Portsmouth. He followed in the footsteps of Robert, and he has agreed to, and I thank you so much, he's agreed to introduce the Katie tonight. So thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I almost thought I was going to like wing it because I'm so personally invested in the book, and I was like, yeah, I'm just going to get up there and speak from the heart, and then I was like, no. So I wrote from the heart instead. The Penny Poet of Portsmouth is as full-hearted and serious-minded a meditation on the writer's life as I've read. While Katherine Towler takes us down the familiar streets of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the details she seeks out and recast are anything but. Finely related and time-tested, squarely met and teamed together, she seamlessly takes measure of not only Robert Dunn's artistic trade in the streets he simultaneously haunted and was haunted by, ceaselessly motioning to in his imagination, but those tensions and areas, moments at rest that make up a fair share of any merger, never mind one of so high a register. It is during these pauses or stays, not always comfortable or easily dealt, where the most is at stake for the writer, and where more is inevitably risked and enacted. It is also the place where those seemingly the least suited for the task are assigned to make what was thought lost, sold out for under us, when the world is casting too wide and monetarily consumed a net into something that is more than just camera ready and minutes lasting. Robert did this, and Katie does it now in kind, thus bestowing the most meaningful gift one can create or recreate, giving someone even more of their due. And we're so happy to have Katie with us today. I was talking to my friend Wayne Atherton recently, who just finished the book, and he probably said it best. He said that while I was reading it, I could feel the presence of Robert there the entire time. And I thought, he said, you know, it just captured not only the voice, but like he said, his presence. So we're so happy to have Katie with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, Dan. Thank you for hosting me. It's wonderful to be back at Water Street, and thank you all for coming. I understand that I've gone up against Maggie Hassan tonight, so I appreciate some of you chose to come here instead of going over to see Maggie.
You've more than held your own.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I'm not running for anything, so thank God. So I'll start out saying a little bit about the book. There may be some people here who don't know who Robert Dunn is, so I'll give you a little background about how I came to write the book. And then I'm going to read 3 short sections, and then I'll be happy to answer questions afterwards. So I met Robert Dunn when I moved to Portsmouth in 1991, and he was actually my next door neighbor, and I'm going to read a little bit in the first section I read, which will tell you how I came to know who he was. He was a poet. He died in 2008, and he assembled his poems in these little books. They were about this big. He sewed them by hand, and he sold them on the streets in Portsmouth for a penny. So that's how he came to be known as the Penny Poet of Portsmouth. From 1999 to 2001, he was the Poet Laureate in Portsmouth, and he did a wonderful job with that, really rose to the occasion. And one of his projects was placing poems in public places around the city, including the parking garage, and there's still a couple of poems in the parking garage. And that was his doing. He also started the Poetry Hoot, the monthly poetry reading, which continues to this day, once a month, the first Wednesday of the month at Cafe Espresso. And it draws about 60 people or more still. So that was a wonderful legacy of Robert's. Robert was a very unique person, and I tried to capture that in this book, and capture also the story of our friendships. So I pulled together how I got to know Robert very gradually over time, because he was a fairly private person. And then at the end of the book, I tell the story of what happened when he became sick. He had COPD. He was quite sick for about 3 years, and I became involved in helping him. There were other people who also did that, but he relied on me pretty heavily, and so I tell the story of what happened to him during those years of his illness, and what happened to me because of becoming so closely involved. It was an unusual situation. I was sort of in the role of a family member, but he wasn't family, and he was a person who was so private, as I said. I felt close to him in some ways, and in other ways felt that I didn't really know him well. So I went through this very intense experience of being with him as he was dying, and that's part of the story in the book. In the book, I also write about Portsmouth, and I tried to capture what the city was like in the early 1990s when I came there, and how it has changed, because it has changed quite a bit since then. And part of what prompted me to write the book was thinking about what the city was like in those days, and how it was a place that suited Robert so much, and he suited the city. It was almost a marriage between them. And it was a community in Portsmouth that made his life possible. He rented a single room in a house on Wooden Street, about 10 minutes from downtown. And he lived in that single room for 25 or more years. There were no outlets in that room, no electrical outlets. There was one bare bulb that came out of the wall. And he worked at the Portsmouth Athenaeum for a couple of hours. Most afternoons he would go in. Even people at the Athenaeum weren't sure exactly what he did there. He didn't have a job title. He was a presence at the Athenaeum, but he did do sort of custodial work. So he would go get the mail at the post office, and he would be there at the end of the day to help lock up, and provided some security in that sense. So that was how he existed on very, very little money. He owned next to nothing. He was a person very free of possessions, and of much of what defines people in our culture. And I admired that a great deal. So I wanted to write about how Portsmouth was a place in those years that made a life like his possible. And then I also write a lot about being a writer, what I learned from Robert about being a writer, and some of the challenges I faced as a writer, and how I came to see some of those challenges differently because of my friendship with him. So I'm threading all of these things together in the story that I tell in this book. And I'll start by reading from the first chapter, and then I'll read a couple of other short sections. So this is chapter 1, Wooden Street. Barely a block long, Wooden Street comes to a dead end at the edge of South Mill Pond and has no real business being called a street. Houses pressed close together face each other across a strip of pavement not much wider than a hallway, their shuttered facades suggesting a scene from an antique postcard. In their mix of colors, cranberry red and white and mustard yellow, the older houses have the solid look of something that has been here a long time. Others are of a more recent vintage, rougher upstarts that match the broken pavement on their front stoops. Our first night in our new house on Wooden Street, I stood at the window and gazed out at the rooftops bathed in the glow from the single streetlight. I had lived in other New England cities, but none of them had felt this old or this quirky, the very shape of the streets telling the story of the past. It was midnight, and I still hadn't found the sheets in the maze of boxes that surrounded me. The sound of bells tolling the hour made me pause for a moment in my frenzy of unpacking. Though the steeple was blocks away in Market Square, it seemed I could reach out the window and touch those solemn notes. They brought the night close and made the darkness familiar in an unfamiliar place. The dank smell of the pond came in through the window, mud laced with a hint of fish, and in the other direction from downtown I heard the piercing note of a boat's whistle out on the river. The hourly tolling of the bells and the traffic on the river would become the soundtrack of my new life, noises that would soon fade into the background. But on that hot night in June of 1991, when I finally arrived somewhere I would stay longer than 6 months or a year, they struck me as the essence of this place I could not quite believe I was going to call home. For more than a decade since graduating from college, I had wandered up and down the eastern seaboard in a restless search for a job, a relationship, and a life that made sense. All too often I had packed everything I owned into a hatchback and started over, certain that another beginning would be the answer. This time I wasn't making the move alone, and I was taking up residence in an actual house, not a one-room studio apartment. The man I was about to marry had driven a U-Haul truck loaded with both our possessions from Boston that morning, and now searched through the mess of boxes with me, as exhausted and apprehensive as I was, both of us nervous and excited to discover where we had landed. In retrospect, our arrival in New Hampshire has a sense of inevitability, the moment when I finally stopped running. But that night, as I sorted through our ill-packed possessions, I felt like I was standing in a doorway, waiting to see whether I would step through to the other side. We were woken at 5:30 the next morning by a very loud and raspy voice barking out the declaration, "Gonna be a hot one." When I raised myself on one elbow and drew back the curtain, I saw a large, unshaven man standing beneath the window in the middle of the street. He wore paint-splattered work pants and construction boots. Beside him stood a petite woman in her 60s with a stack of newspapers in her arms. She handed him one and said, "If it burns off." "Oh, it'll burn off all right," he said. The woman went back up the street, but he remained beneath our window, with a coffee mug in one hand and the newspaper in the other, glancing from side to side as though expecting someone else to appear and continue the conversation. I would learn that Ed greeted the woman who delivered the newspaper like this every morning. Fog hung over the pond in a milky sheen that gave the water the look of a clouded mirror. I made my way down the back stairs to the kitchen, thinking that even the weather here had an old-fashioned feel, the wispy fog seeming to trace the shape of tall ships coming into the harbor. The steps beneath my feet were worn down, hollowed into small depressions by nearly 2 centuries of use, and they were so narrow I had to descend carefully to avoid tumbling straight down the whole flight. The house needed a good cleaning before we could even begin to unpack, and after breakfast I unearthed the vacuum and set to work. The place had clearly seemed hard used by previous tenants. The walls were pockmarked with nail holes, and the paint was worn. Still, it felt like a palace to me, with 3 rooms downstairs and 3 upstairs. I wasn't used to having this much space, and I found the sloped floors and narrow closets with their tiny latch doors fascinating. Evidence of just how old this house was, 1830 the rental agent had told us, was there wherever I turned. The thin lintels of the mantelpieces, the ceramic doorknobs with their amber hue, the antique glass in the windows that gave the scene on the other side a wavering quality, like a drawing done in sand. I was enthralled with this shabby old place, with the idea of living in a house so quintessentially New England. We met most of our neighbors over the next few days. It was hard to avoid living in such close quarters. Eleanor came over to introduce herself from the house directly across the street, where she lived with her mother and her niece. Her parents had owned the place since the 1940s, she told us, and she had grown up there. Eleanor belonged to the group of old-timers on the block whose houses, like ours, remained pretty close to their original states. Others were recent transplants who had restored their antique houses to a polished authenticity. Being renters, we fell somewhere in between the two groups. No matter how long any of us had been there or where we had come from, though, we were united by the cats. Wooden Street really belonged to them. We had just Zane, a fiercely smart and independent stray Jim had taken in down in Boston, where he had been living when we met, but our neighbors had 2 or 3 each, which meant that the felines outnumbered the humans on the block. The lone plot of grass adjoined our house, and it was here that the cats congregated and engaged in a contest to determine who would rule this corner of town. The contest had been decided before we arrived on the scene. Roscoe, a mean orange tabby, would tear up any cat who challenged him, but Roscoe felt compelled to remind the other cats of this fact on a regular basis. Those first weeks in Portsmouth, I went out walking, exploring the town by wandering its maze of skinny streets. Most days I encountered a tiny gaunt man somewhere on my route, crossing Market Square, emerging from the post office, or seated on the stone wall by the 18th century gravestones on Pleasant Street. He moved with a slow deliberation, shoulders hunched forward, in a flimsy black trench coat and a flat cap, a styrofoam coffee cup in one hand and a cigarette between the fingers of the other. His face was framed by glasses with thick black rims, and a bristled mustache obscured his lips. He might have been in his late 40s or early 70s, there was no way to tell. He seemed to be a fixture downtown, a part of the streetscape, and I assumed from this and his worn clothes that he was homeless. He had the look of someone who wandered with no destination and might not have eaten in some time. This strange little man, moving like a leaf nudged by the wind, his body bent in such a stoop that he appeared not much more than 5 feet in height, though he was clearly taller, belonged among these streets that had once been cow paths. He struck me as a figure like so much in the landscape of Portsmouth out of another century. One afternoon, when I happened to glance out the window at the right moment, I saw him passing by our house. What was he doing, I wondered, all the way at the dead end of Wooden Street? The next day I paid closer attention and caught him emerging from the house on the other side of our patch of lawn by the pond. Shortly after this, I stepped onto the street one day just as he did so. He raised his head and his eyes darted away, the only acknowledgement I received. Our house, like many in the neighborhood, had a dirt cellar. When I took the shallow stairs into its dank depths, I could see the rock ledge on which the foundation rested, jutting from the dirt wall behind the furnace. Almost 2 centuries earlier, the earth had been carved to hold the house, and it was easy to imagine men with shovels executing the job. A window not much bigger than a business envelope was cut into the base of the foundation. We left the window unlatched so Zane could go in and out. When the garbage men backed their truck down Wooden Street, he would fly through the window and race upstairs to hide under the couch. One evening we found Zane crouched by the basement door, hissing. Further investigation revealed Roscoe pressed to a moldy corner of the basement. We propped the window open, but he did not budge. After 15 minutes of attempting to coax him toward the window, we went out into the yard to call him from the other side. Jim and I were standing next to the house, calling Roscoe's name, when the diminutive man I had observed downtown came down the street. It was a cool night, and he was wearing a brown corduroy jacket that looked like a relic from the 1960s instead of his trench coat. He stopped when he reached us and said, "We have a renegade cat, do we?" I had not articulated it to myself, but clearly I had formed an expectation of what it might be like to hear him talk, because I was so startled by his speech. I explained that Roscoe was in the basement, refusing to come out. He bent down by the basement window and called, "Roscovich, my dear Roscovich, do come here." He sounded like he was reciting Shakespeare in his soft and lilting voice. After a moment, Roscoe jumped through the window and went darting toward the house next door. "I do apologize," he said, "but I'm afraid that cat has a mind of his own." I thanked him, but he had already turned away and evaporated down the bit of pavement between our houses. So I will jump ahead and read a short section from chapter 11. So I did get to know Robert over the years. He did finally engage in conversation with me, though it wasn't always easy to get him to do that. And as people remember him will tell you, it often could be difficult to understand him. He spoke in a very low tone of voice and often mumbled. Now, what he had to say was utterly brilliant, so you really wanted to hear it, because almost nothing came out of his mouth that wasn't brilliant. But it was sometimes a challenge to catch all his little brilliant comments. But I did get to know him over the years, partly by proximity of being his neighbor, but also going to readings, poetry readings in town. He would often show up. And then I got to know him more when he became the Poet Laureate. I was on the board of the Poet Laureate programs, so I started driving him to board meetings, which he enjoyed attending, to our great surprise. He did like to attend the board meetings. And so I would give him rides, and in all these ways I got to know him more. So this little section I'll read is in the time after Robert has become sick. On the eastern edge of the country, night comes quickly in winter, bringing a darkness that seems impenetrable by 4:30 in the afternoon. I never quite become accustomed to setting off for the post office in the dark, swaddled in scarf and gloves. One day that December, I had to make the trip by walking in the middle of the street along the river because the sidewalks were covered in mounds of snow left by the first storm of the season. The moon, just coming up, emerged from behind elongated clouds to cast a wispy light. As I made my way back home, my head was level with windows that allowed me to peer into my neighbors' lives. I passed a young man seated at a computer so close to the sidewalk that I could have reached out and touched him if the window had been open. He did not turn his head as I went by. I spotted another man in a second-story window also at the computer and thought how we are all tethered to our electronic devices day and night now. Since his hospitalization, Robert had been on steroids and an array of other drugs, one designed to counteract the side effects of the next. The drugs made it possible for him to breathe and eat. He could walk short distances over to the bank or to the bookstore, but the rest of downtown was out of reach. That night, as I covered one of his old routes, the emptiness of the street came home to me. It wasn't just the hour and the silence of winter and the single figures in the windows bathed in the glow from computer screens. Robert was missing. Bystanders at heart, writers are practiced in the art of watching. We live each moment twice as human beings who inhabit these bodies and interact with others, and as writers who note what can be used and file it away. Every story someone tells us is potential material, every overheard conversation possible inspiration. Uncurtained windows are opportunities. Robert was a practiced observer, his watching honed to a heightened sensitivity. He made Portsmouth his canvas and for 30 years covered these streets with an eye to picking up every unexpected treasure, every small revelation, every window into other lives. The novelist Wallace Stegner, in an essay titled The Sense of Place, says of Americans, always hopeful of something better, hooked on change, a lot of us have never stayed in one place long enough to learn it, or have learned it only to leave it. Robert had clearly learned Portsmouth. Robert's fundamental contentment with himself and the world enabled him to see more. He was not, like the rest of us, constantly looking over his shoulder to reevaluate the past or trying to make the future bend to his will. He understood that the search for something better was a false search. Whatever he needed, which wasn't much, could be found right here. This is the mark of real brilliance, to be profoundly engaged with what is simple and ordinary, and to know it is rich beyond measure. Robert worked with a small canvas, secure in the knowledge that there were no limits to what he could do with that canvas. There was always poetry to be found in his daily walks, his stops at the post office and coffee shop, and the scene in Market Square. There's an irony in our looking to someone like Robert, who deliberately defined himself outside the mainstream of human life, to tell us about the living of that life. This person watching from the sidelines should, it seem, be the least qualified to illuminate our experience, but this is what we ask of writers. The ones who produce the most lasting books are often ruthless at separating themselves from the world. In this riddle lies the uncertainty at the heart of the writer's work. We have no right to make claims for the rest of our human brothers and sisters, but this is precisely what we do. We plant a flag at the summit of human experience. We assert that though we might be quiet, watchful types prone to lurking in corners, we have some insight into the lives of our more active neighbors that gives us the license to tell their stories. Solitude is not a recipe by itself for good writing, nor does good writing necessarily require solitude. But often when these elements come together at the highest levels, something sublime occurs. Robert is a good example. He was beloved as a poet among those who knew his work in New Hampshire and beyond, because he had his finger on the pulse of a few significant truths and translated them into language that, though the voice might have been quirky and unpredictable, was instantly recognizable as our own common language. He stood outside the world while giving it back to us whole. So I will end with some words from Robert. So when I was writing the book, I interviewed a lot of people. I went on a search for more information about Robert's life because, as I may have indicated already, he didn't in conversation talk about himself much. He didn't talk about much of a personal nature. He didn't talk about his past. He liked to talk about books, poetry, ideas, sometimes politics. Town politics, he was always interested in that. But he didn't talk much about himself. So I interviewed a number of people, 25 or so, who had known Robert over the years. I interviewed his college roommate to try to learn more about him. And I learned a few things that I hadn't known when he was alive. And in the appendix of the book, I include some of those things I learned about him after his death. I also went through the collections at the Portsmouth Athenaeum, and Dick Winslow, if any of you know him, he's the curator of one of the history collections at the Portsmouth Library. He tirelessly collected and put in a folder at the Athenaeum any press Robert Dunn received, going back to, I think the earliest ones were the early 80s or mid 80s. So anytime there was anything about Robert in the newspaper, and he was profiled a number of times by Foster's, the Portsmouth Herald, once in the Boston Globe in the New England section. So I went through those clippings and compiled some of the quotes, and I'll read you some of these quotes that appeared in those feature articles. On being a poet, when I'm really doing my job as a poet, I'm not speaking to you, I'm speaking for you. On the kind of poems he writes. Using a poem to drive home a point is a bit like using a violin for a hammer. It wouldn't make a good hammer, but afterwards it wouldn't be a good violin either. That's why I avoid didactic poetry. I think basically a poem ought to say what it's got to say and get off the stage. On his education. I didn't start getting an education until I got out of school. On the writing process. I put marks on paper every day, but they generally wind up in the wastebasket. A wastebasket is a great resource for a writer, I think. On copyright. It just feels kind of silly posting no trespassing signs on my poems. So at the start of all of his books, he put a note that the poems were not copyrighted. On making a living as a poet. What I make would be a comfortable middle-class income in any of the African countries. It seems graceless to complain. It's a topic that arises whenever 2 or 3 artists get together, a familiar rap. I've known painters and filmmakers who couldn't work because they didn't have enough money to buy materials. With me, it's never been a problem. There's always a scrap of paper. So something else that Robert did in the years before he moved to Portsmouth, he was part of an apple picking crew that went around to orchards in New England. And apples appear as a recurring theme in his poems. So this is on the similarity between apple picking and poetry. It's something you do very gently with all your might. On the city of Portsmouth. Walking through downtown Portsmouth, you get the feeling it's always been this way, even though it changes constantly. On the course of his life. Everybody has one worse thing that can happen to them. If worse came to worse, I'd be teaching English at a small Catholic girls' school in the Midwest. On his knowledge. I don't know a thing about baseball. On his living situation. I'm always aware that there are people without even one room. On being termed a hermit, which he denied. Any of us writers, we desperately need a few hours of quiet. Thank you. Before I take questions, I'll make one little announcement. So, as part of the project of bringing this book out, I also wanted to do a collection of Robert's poems, and that has just come out from Hobblebush. So this is more or less Robert's collected works. I edited this with Sid Hall and Roger Martin, and I'm really grateful to Hobblebush for bringing this out. They've done a beautiful job. And I really thought when we did this project that we were going to publish Robert Dunn's collected poems. And of course, just in the days after we had it had gone off, it's gone to the printer, someone appeared with this poem on a scrap of paper that Robert gave them years ago, and I realized there will never be a collected Robert Dunn. He will not let it happen. The whole way that he shared his poems with people was so quirky, and he kept no records. I inherited his papers when he died. He did not keep a record of his publications. He did not keep a collection of his penny books. So it was very hard to reconstruct and track down every poem. But I tracked down as many as I could, and this is a fairly complete edition. And at the end, there are 10 poems that he wrote in the last 3 years of his life that have not been published before. So those are included in this book. And anyway, I'm just delighted that this is out. The title, One of Us is Lost. comes from Robert's poem, which I will now recite for you, to poem number 116. To umbrella number 116, One of Us is Lost. So, and this book is here and available for sale tonight also.
Actually, the audience tonight has purchased every copy.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, it is now sold out, but Dan will be happy to order copies if anyone
And
would
if I
like
could
them.
interject, we have 2 Ferguson readings left, 2 poetry readings, and it's an open reading that follows. And we have, is it Outlook Springs? I keep forgetting the name. But Outlook Springs, which is a literary magazine, which I'm sure would have been an outfit that would have been favorable for Robert to send to. We'll be celebrating them. It's the second Wednesday of the month, so that will be this month, a week from tomorrow. And then let me get this right, in June, we'll be extending the series so we can celebrate Robert's book. So there will be several local poets reading from the book and sharing memories. So hopefully you can join us for that. And now some questions.
Katie, how long have you been doing the research and when did you start on this?
So Robert died in 2008, and it was about maybe 9 months later I did the first writing that led to the book. And as I said, it was such an intense experience going through his illness and his death with him, and I knew that I needed to write about the experience to process it. I knew that there were so many sort of unanswered questions for me about why I had been that person there with Robert and how he had challenged me in so many ways. So I wanted to write about it, and I started out and I wrote an essay. It was about a 20-page essay, and I spent maybe 6 weeks on that essay, and I finished it, and I said, this doesn't do it, It just scratched the surface. So I realized I really needed to write a book. So that's when I started. It took me 3.5 years to write the book.
Has it been, really?
Yeah, and then of course you finish the book, and then by the time it's published, it's another 2 years after that. So. Yeah.
Was it draining for you at times? I mean, it seems like we're all getting pulled into the whole story of him. Was it hard for you sometimes doing the research on this?
Sometimes, but mostly I enjoyed the process. I started out just writing for about 9 months, and I wrote anything that came to me, and I put it in a continuous file on my computer that came to 100 pages. I just kept dumping into that file, and I didn't think about the structure of the book. I didn't try to create a chronology, just anything that came to me that I remembered, that I was thinking about, I just put it all in that file. Then I had all of this material that I assembled and created a structure for the book out of. There were times when, it made me sad to be working on it, but most of the time I was bringing back things I wanted to remember.
Sounds amazing. Can't wait to start.
Thank you.
I think you've already started to answer this, but since you've written so many novels, how was this different, the process of writing it? And in what ways did it feel maybe liberating or limiting to work in nonfiction?
I found it really liberating to work in nonfiction, and maybe it's because particularly I wrote a trilogy of novels, and so I was really, wedded in that project to being driven by plot. I had to think about plot a lot, and I had to think about how to get the characters and stories to connect. And here, I wasn't thinking about plot. The shape of the story was already given to me. And so it felt very freeing to me to be able to explore what I was thinking and feeling and remembering without having to make it go somewhere, the way you do with a novel. Because in writing a novel, you really have to know what happens next in order to continue writing. But I didn't have that problem with this. So I really enjoyed writing nonfiction. And my novels are all in third person, and here I was in first person. So it felt freeing to me.
Do you do that continuous file when you do a novel, or does that?
No, see, with a novel, I feel like I have to be driven much more by figuring out a plot and structure. And it feels in some ways more constraining than this did. So after I wrote this book, I wondered, could I write a novel this way? And I would like to try it, to just, you know, to write in a freer way. But it's something about puzzling the story and structure of a novel out that I could never just sort of write random scenes. I had to know how they fit and where they were going in the structure as a whole in order, you know, to continue with it. So we'll see. I'll experiment and see if I can do it with a novel.
We'll reconvene here for when you read that.
As I've been reading, I've been super impressed by your ability to sort of show how complicated his death is and your relationship with him. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about what it was like to maybe put not the most beautiful or the most winning moments of yourself onto the page. And did you struggle with that, or were there moments where you thought, I'd like to say that I did this, but I didn't, I did this other thing?
Yes, there were moments when I thought that, when I thought, well, you know, I tried to be honest about what had happened, and what happened was that in some ways he appointed me to be this person. And I was sort of put in a position that I hadn't exactly sought out or asked for. And there were times when we were in conflict with each other, and it was difficult because he wanted to stay alone in his apartment to the end, and that was very difficult to make that happen. And he was in his apartment by himself almost to the end. But there were times when that was not possible. And he wanted me to, you know, to break him out of the rehab unit at the nursing home and so forth. And so, you know, it put me in a difficult position with the doctor saying one thing, Robert saying another. So I tried to be honest about what happened, and the only way to tell the story was to do that, to capture who he was and who I was and what happened to both of us. And that was the story I wanted to tell, even though it wasn't always pretty.
I mean, that tension is part of what has kept me grieving, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, good, thank you.
Katie, I wondered if, they did a great job, by the way, in the design. It's a really classic design in that book. But I was wondering if, when the publisher decided to take it on, did they articulate for you what they saw that was universal in this very local story about a very local man?
Well, the editing process was very interesting because I was prepared to have the book accepted and to have an editor want me to repackage it. To say, you know, to make this book sell, you're gonna have to spin it a different way. And that's not what happened. So the editor, he went through the whole manuscript and at really key places over and over again said, tell me more, I want more. Dig deeper. And that was the best possible kind of editing. I mean, he's really an old school, wonderful editor. Because what he did is he took what I had done and tried to help me expand it. But he wasn't trying to change the story. And I think that he felt, and you know, my publisher felt, that Robert was such an interesting character, and that I had captured the dynamic of our friendship, and that the way I wrote about Portsmouth would be of interest to people from other parts of the country. So, I mean, that seems to be holding up. I have gotten some fan mail from people in Ohio, so you know, and they seem to be appreciating the book. So that you know, that was very nice. When my editor accepted the book, and my agent told me that he said to her, "I don't even know what to call this," because it wasn't a biography, but it wasn't exactly a typical memoir, and I was really pleased by that comment because that's what I intended. I wanted a sort of hybrid book, and that's the way he saw it.
I got two questions that I don't think not anything to do with each other. One, when you're talking about threads earlier, and then working with the editor, in threading this together, did you have any strands that you had to give up on, that you felt like ultimately? And then the second question I'm going to have is kind of a two-parter, so there's a lot to answer. But the other question is it possible for someone like Robert to exist in today's world, and where would they have to go in the the United States, because the world, obviously. And do you feel like in some ways, I'm not sure how to phrase this, but did it catch up to Robert? Like, was he like at the end, we're in a country where I'm not sure we can live like this anymore, but even more so, can we die can we die with integrity? And do you feel like at the end that Robert was able to maintain that, or because of this struggle in trying to bring people in like yourself to help him out, I mean, he ultimately in some ways had to go against his kind of creed for living in some regards?
Right. All right, I'll answer the second question first. So Robert really lived outside the system, for his entire life. He never owned a car, a telephone, a computer, a television, and he really carved this life out for himself that was outside of how American culture is typically defined. At the end of his life, in order to keep living, he had to become part of the system, And I think that was difficult for him. And at key moments, I wondered, like, what kind of choices and decisions would he make? But every time he made the decision that he wanted to live, and that he wanted more time. And in order to do that, that meant letting in the visiting nurses and conforming to the requirements of the hospice care and all of that. And so he was very tenacious when he went through his first major hospitalization and he came home. And he had given me permission to talk to the doctors and the social workers. I talked to the social worker and I said, "How long do you think he has to live?" And she said, 2 to 3 weeks. And he lived 3 more years.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, he beat the odds over and over again. Really surprised people. He was very tenacious. But, he had to, I think, make a lot of compromises in order to do that. It seems pretty clear that someone like Robert couldn't come to Portsmouth today and live the way he did in Portsmouth, right? There may be other places in America where that would be possible, but to find a place the way he did that he could afford to rent within walking distance of downtown, I don't see that happening now. My colleague, I teach at Southern New Hampshire University in the MFA program. My colleague Mark Sundin has written a wonderful book called The Man Who Quit Money, and it's about a man in Utah who has lived without money now for about 14 years. Now, he lives part of the time in a cave in the desert, but he has managed to do this. And it's very interesting, and the book is fantastic because it's about how someone like this can pull this off and make a very profound political statement, which he is doing. So, I mean, I think there are examples like that, and you can find them in all kinds of places. But certainly, in a town like Portsmouth that is becoming increasingly wealthy and upscale, you're going to find fewer and fewer people like that. All right, the first part of your question, there were some threads I really pulled back on, that I pruned a lot.
Yeah.
So I had a lot more about Portsmouth, and I kind of boiled that down. And I had more about my own history as a writer, and I pulled back on that. Because it was getting to, long and unwieldy, those sections. So.
J.J. Newberry still in the book?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
in the book,
Okay.
yeah, that's still in the book, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was one of my favorite places when I came to Portsmouth, and it wasn't there for too long. I closed a couple of years after I came to Portsmouth, so. The dime store in Market Square.
I can still remember that.
All right, well, thank you all very much. I'll be happy to sign books, and thank you so much for coming.
I've been living in a cave for the last 14 years.
Uh,